Mødet åbnet. Velkommen tilbage.
Welcome back from lunch with the Queen. And we're now going to go on to the point 11 with our guest speaker. And our guest speaker is NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. And this symbolizes this strong development that we've had in the collaboration on defense with in the Nordic Council. It started with Thorvald Stoltenberg's report, which has been a sort of a Bible for us in the Nordic Council and also with Council of Ministers, and followed by the Bjarnason report, which came out 2 years ago on cybersecurity. And now we have our NATO Secretary General visiting us, and it says something about the fact that now defense policy is now once again at the core of Nordic collaboration. Last year, we didn't have a guest speaker because we didn't have a session last year. The year before, it was Theresa May who was the year before, and earlier we have had Helmut Kohl as guest speaker. And so it is a very good group of speakers that Stoltenberg is going. He is very welcome to speak for 20 minutes to us, and after that will be time for a good debate. Mr. Stoltenberg, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Bertil, and dear all, it is a great honor, and I'm so happy to be able to speak here at the Nordic Council. I'm always happy to be back in Copenhagen, the King City, where I always meet the Queen. And being here in Denmark, that is such a strong NATO ally, and be able to discuss security policy. For many years we didn't do that, but now security policy is part of the national agenda. You mentioned my father, and if he had known that I was standing here talking about security policy, he would be so happy, because doing and kind of making security policy to an item on the agenda here has been a long journey. I'm happy to be back here to meet the Nordic Council. I was an MP in the Norwegian Parliament and also Prime Minister and a minister. I was there for 25 years, but I can remember that sometimes I was a bit frustrated that the decisions the parliamentarians did were not always followed up by the governments as quickly and as properly as we want. I'm quite sure that you have resolved that issue now, because now you have government that is more on the ball than during my time. But I learned when I was here earlier, and I see it now even better from the outside, that the Nordic Council is important, because Nordic Council builds trust, peace, and also friendship, and we need that during a time when countries need to cooperate more. We live in times of peace here in the Nordics, but that doesn't come as a matter of course. We have waged wars from the Viking area through the medieval times and later the Nordic War, and small and large wars, Napoleonic wars, but now we live in peace. That is not only thanks to the Nordic Council, but Nordic Council helps provide stability and peace. And we should really bear that in mind, because such institutions are also important from a security policy vantage point. When we kind of look up a bit, then we see it even clearer, because Europe has also been war-ridden, and now it is characterized by peace. And that can also be attributed to institutions, two important institutions established after the Second World War, NATO and the European Union. I'm fully aware that not all the Nordic countries are members of both organizations, but we all benefit from the stability and trust that these institutions create. And this means, for example, that countries such as Norway and Iceland that are not members of the European Union, they also benefit from the European Union building friendship, trust and peace between European countries such as France and Germany. And it means that countries such as Finland and Sweden that are not members of NATO, they also have advantages from NATO being and providing a framework for political security efforts between the United States and Europe. So all the Nordic countries benefit from the strong institutions that we built up after the Second World War in order to safeguard peace. I had an excellent meeting with the Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, to discuss how we could further strengthen NATO. I see that the Norwegian Prime Minister is here. For many years he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Norway, and I remember that he taught us one thing, namely that in the Nordics and in Europe we live in what we call deep peace. And a state of deep peace is good, because it means that we can't even imagine war, because we have been living for so long in peaceful times, and that's good. But it's also risky, Jonas told us, because it means that it may be easy to forget how dangerous, how brutal war is. War is horrifying because it's all about death, it is about all the other horrific times, and it destroys everything that we want to achieve, regardless of whether it's to combat climate change, because as countries it requires that we work together, and that means that it's the basis for everything else. So our task is to continue to maintain that deep peace, but also to do the right things to secure peace in Europe and in our part of the world, in the Nordics. NATO's mission is to safeguard peace, prevent war. We have done that since it was formed in 1949, and we have succeeded because we have kept changing. For 40 years, there was only one mission in NATO, and that was to deter the Soviet Union, and that lasted from 1949 until 1979. And then it took us two brutal ethnic wars in the Balkans, against Kosovo and in Bosnia, but after 9/11 in 2001, we have been at the forefront to fight international terrorism, and also after Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, we have also strengthened our joint defense. We work more in the Baltics, and also we have invested more in our defense. Those are key, and NATO is the most successful alliance in the world because we have been able to change with the world, and because we have stood shoulder by shoulder. We will need more of both of these things in the years ahead, because we live in a time and age with many different security challenges interacting. We also see that Russia uses military force and power against their neighbors, investing in military capabilities. Among other things, they also deploy the middle-range nuclear arms, and that also caused important international work on disarmament to break down. And they use many various policy instruments to impact us, and they continue to threaten neighboring countries such as the Ukraine and Georgia. NATO's approach, which is actually also the Nordic approach to Russia, follows a dual track. It's strength and firmness, and its dialogue. We regret that Russia recently closed down both NATO's offices in Moscow and also closed down the NATO representation. So we no longer have the systematic dialogue with Russia that we would want to, but we continue to work to promote disarmament and dialogue because there's no alternative. Russia will remain our biggest neighbor. We also see the growth of China. China will soon be the world's largest economy. It has already the second largest defense budget. It already has the biggest naval fleet, and it's building a vast number of missile silos, and it can reach all member countries, even those in Europe. And we see in China that also do as they please in Asia. They don't share our values in terms of democracy and human rights. We see what they do in Hong Kong, and they also detain and persecute ethnic and religious minorities. And as a Norwegian Prime Minister, I also saw that they punished other countries when the Independent Nobel Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident. Denmark saw that when you invited Dalai Lama to visit, and also Sweden experienced that when they awarded a prize to a Chinese activist. And we see that there is also threats now because they have attacked some of the values. But we need to stand together as like-minded countries believing in democracy and peace. And it's important to uphold that when we see the growth of China. This will be something new that we haven't experienced for centuries, that the biggest power in the world don't believe in our values. And we are moving towards situations like that when China keeps growing. We also have a threat of new terrorist attacks, and this is a constant danger. We need to be at the forefront to combat that. We have just ended our military presence in Afghanistan, but this is not the end of the fight. We will continue to be active in the global coalition to defeat ISIS, and Denmark is also leading a training mission in Iraq. Our presence in Afghanistan was not in vain. We defeated Al-Qaeda. For 20 years, we have prevented new terrorist attacks against our countries organized from Afghanistan. But our presence in Afghanistan is also something that reminds us of what it means to go in with a military presence. We need to learn the lessons, but we should not draw wrongful conclusions from our military presence in Afghanistan. There may be future situations where we need to stand up against terror, as we did, among other things, in Iraq and Syria, when we defeated ISIS and liberated the areas under their control. There are also many other challenges, but I have promised to leave time for questions, and therefore I would like to say that there are major other challenges: cyber, hybrid attacks, the spread of nuclear weapon, or what we discussed in Glasgow yesterday, namely that climate change also have clear climate, military and defense-related challenges. And we need to discuss it all in the same frame. And all these challenges are different, but they share one common thing, namely that if North America and Europe stand together, then we can deal with them. If we split up and stand alone, we can't. So my most important message to you today is that we need to continue to maintain the historic cooperations that was established after the Second World War, the close ties between Western democracy in Europe and North America. And there is an historic opportunity to do so because we have an administration, a president of the United States, that are strong and ardent supporters of transatlantic cooperation, that want more cooperation with Europe. And it is possible. This is something that we as Europeans need to just accept. And we also see that the Americans also increase their presence in Europe, and therefore it's not only grand words, it's also translated into action. We would also translate the cooperation between NATO and the European Union. And one thing that I'm quite proud of during my term as Secretary General in NATO, that we are working closer together than ever before. And many of you here in this room know that I'm an ardent supporter of the European Union. Twice I have tried to convince Norwegian people accordingly. Both attempts failed, but I have a kind of a personal membership of the EU because the EU invites the Secretary General of NATO to meetings in the European Parliament, to the Commission, etc. So I am a proud practicing personal member of the European Union. But even more important than that is that this is how we have been able to forge closer ties, because we have so many matters to work on. 90% of the EU inhabitants live in a NATO country, and therefore we need to build on this cooperation. I and NATO have also welcomed increased action from the EU in the area of defense, as long as it implies new capabilities, and we build new tanks or vessels or drones, or increase the emergency preparedness of units, and invest more in the defense, because we need more European states with more military capabilities. What we don't need is more structures that will only compete for the same capabilities, because we're talking about the same soldiers, same states, and we won't be safer if we develop new structures that compete for the same capabilities. That will only create an overlap, lack of clarity, and basically just do that you weaken NATO instead of strengthening NATO. So new capabilities and capacities, but not new structures. That is an important message when Europe is looking to do more in the area of defense. I would like to leave you by simply saying that I don't believe in Europe alone. I don't believe in the United States alone, but I believe in Europe and North America together in NATO, in close collaboration with our close partners, Finland and Sweden. If we achieve this, we will continue to be able to live in deep peace here in the Nordic region and in Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jens Stoltenberg, for not just as being a representative of your organization, but also because you are a very good and engaged Norwegian, and that you realize that we don't just sit around tables in international arenas, we are also there to lead. And thank you for your historical perspective, which also reaffirms that all this cooperation when it comes to security and defense policy has been strengthened since the Kalmar Union, and that's a perspective that is worth looking at. Thank you for your powerful speech, and now we have plenty of time, almost 40 minutes, for questions and answers. And Jens Stoltenberg will stay at the podium. So what we now have is now rejoinders, 2 minutes each. And I have a speakers list, and where I can see that the first speaker is Jorud Asbjell. Jorud, you have the floor.
First,
thank you very much. I want to thank the Secretary General for taking the time to come here and meet us. And I can also say to Mr. Stoltenberg that the progress made on various cases is still the same here, although we're not still dealing with the same matters as when you were there. Nordic cooperation is very good, and I believe that is true since you come here. But the political landscape, when it changes materially, both within countries, between countries, and between contingents, we also need a stronger NATO alliance going forward. And in our Presidium's program, Nordic defense collaboration is very important. My question to Mr. Stoltenberg is, what is NATO's view on the Nordic region? How can we deepen and strengthen the defense cooperation in addition to NATO's work?
Thank you. And we've decided that all speakers will have 1 minute, and that was then Jens Stoltenberg has 2 minutes to answer.
Thank you. Good. The brief answer is that we look very positively to the Nordic defense collaboration. That is cooperation between countries that are partly members of NATO, partly not members of NATO. And we believe that it also helps strengthen the collaboration between NATO and Sweden and Finland. We also see that there are joint exercising and training, and we also see this in the framework of getting communication systems and systems for dealing with crisis. So we are ardent supporters of the Nordic defense collaboration. It is valuable in itself, but it also helps strengthen the cooperation between NATO and the near partners, such as Sweden and Finland. All right, I have to walk down now to get my papers, and then I come back up.
While you do that, we will ask the Icelandic minister who would like to have the floor. You have 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Jens, for your view on the threats and challenges when it comes to defense. Iceland has not missed the changes that is happening in the world when it comes to security and defense, the instability and also the tensions on the international arenas is also, and they also color the situation that we are in. And we would like to say that our membership in NATO and the alliance that we have is in this the largest area of collaboration that we have, and that we have to, and with this, and also through collaboration with Sweden and Finland, I'm very happy that we also have that. And the security and defense of the Arctic region has changed, and this there's going to be, and Iceland has said that has certain goals for the Arctic, and we want to have a low tension in the Arctic region. But then again, tensions are increasing in this area, and one of the biggest is the threat of also military threats and of that area. Could you give us some more information about that? How we can maintain the low tensions in the area?
We've always said that in the high north, the level of tension should be low, and that is still a goal. The challenge is, of course, how can we achieve that? Once we see a significant military build-up, we see it primarily represented by Russia, new armed systems for the Northern Fleet, but also new missile systems. They use the high north to test new armed systems. We also see many more submarines operating in the northern waters. I think that we should do the same thing as we also try to do in the rest of Europe, namely to be clear and stand firm, and to show presence, to show that these are also areas where we are entitled to operate. There are several NATO members that are also Arctic countries, and Sweden and Finland are also Arctic countries. So we need presence, activities, and we also need activity. And one thing that we do in NATO, and the reason why we need to invest, is that we need capabilities able to operate in the high north. It's fighting planes, sensors, and also vessels that can operate in those waters, and it's expensive. But we also need to collaborate, and even though we struggle between the collaborations with NATO countries, non-NATO countries and Russia, but the question is, how can we do it? We have the Arctic Council, an important platform for the environment and other issues. We also have the Barents Sea collaboration. They recently met in Tromsø with the Prime Minister Lavrov, and where we cooperate on many important matters. So we can collaborate. We collaborate on search and rescue, other important things, and we need to continue doing that, but also show presence, not the kind of experience that there are certain areas of the High North where we can't operate, even though it's international waters. All right, so that is in brief presence, firmness, and also try to maintain the dialogue.
Thank you. And then Linda Mordic from the Centre Group. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary-General, for a powerful and very good presentation. And when there are times of trouble, then you know who your friends are. We are still in the middle of a pandemic, unfortunately. An invisible enemy and now a deadly virus is amongst us, and now has also caused thousands of deaths in the Nordics, in Europe, and millions in the whole world. Still, established collaboration structures and in the Nordics have not actually stood the test that they should have had. We did not have enough personal protective gear, and that was something of a Wild West situation, in fact, and many suddenly only thought about themselves. One of NATO's most characteristics is about defense, and the Danish presidency had a good briefing about how Syria's patrol works, and it was very fascinating how seamlessly they worked. And I want to ask how we in the Nordic countries, in and outside of NATO, from our experiences now, could develop a civil-military kind of operations worth its name and have a real solidarity worth its name that would work in all weathers and not only in sunshine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In Norway, we say that necessity is the mother of all invention. I think it goes. But, well, we have many experiences through the coronavirus situations. We have a Prime Minister, and there are many other capable people who can say more about this than I can. But what I can say is that the pandemic has reminded us that there is a dependence between the military sector and the civil sector, and that works both ways. We saw that in many NATO countries, the military also helped deal with the pandemic, to put up mobile hospitals, to receive patients during the time of severe pressure in the civil health sector. And the military stepped in. Everything you can do to ensure that the armed forces can contribute more, that would be good for NATO, and then it would also be good for the NATO member states. If we look at it from the other side, of course, one of the things that we do in the NATO, namely modernizing NATO, is about resilience. Resilience when it comes to our civil infrastructure is important. It's about the supply lines. And we need to increase the awareness about the vulnerability. We need to develop guidelines, standards for how to secure critical supply lines and infrastructure, and that is part of what the NATO 2030 program is all about. And pandemic is part of this situation. So learning lessons and action are aspects that should come out of it.
And Hans Wallmark. Thank you, Chair. As a representative of the Conservative Group, I'm very happy to represent the only party group in the Nordic Council where all of the representatives are for NATO membership, regardless of which of the 5 states we come from. After the Utøya, then Sweden said that Jens Stoltenberg was the Prime Minister for all of the Nordic countries. Today, after the presentation, I can say that I am also that Stoltenberg from NATO is all of our Secretary General. And Stoltenberg, together with NATO, were in Finland and Sweden a week ago. Very welcome. And also we talked about climate changes and security policy are very important on our political agenda, and also how we, in different ways, try to strengthen our own defence. Stoltenberg's pointed out that 90% of all in the EU live in a NATO country, and you can also add that 80% of all of NATO's capacity comes from outside an EU country, and that's why there's reason to think about these relationships. It's also, as he said, that you can only be in or outside NATO, and that is why I would like to ask the question, and because we did a poll in Sweden, and isn't it good that countries like Sweden that prepare for an application, but the decision is always remains with the country itself. Isn't that right?
We greatly appreciate the collaboration with Sweden and Finland. I visited Sweden and Finland along with the NATO's Council, and I met you, among others, but also Prime Minister Löfven and Prime Minister Sanna Marin of Finland and many other political leaders. And my message is that we would like to cooperate. For those who will choose to be outside of NATO, our door is open. And one of the best things that's happened during the past decade is, of course, the extension and expansion of the EU and NATO that helps spread peace and freedom across Europe. But I also want to say that this must be a Sweden and Finnish decision. If I, as Secretary General of NATO, try to give advice to Sweden, and especially if you're a Norwegian Secretary General, then it would actually have the opposite effect. So therefore, I would simply like to conclude that that is a decision that Sweden and Finland need to take.
And then Daniel Riesat. Thank you very much, Chair and delegates and Secretary General. With the risk that there won't be any applause, I'd like to anyway put this question. 20 years ago, then the USA invaded another countries, including Nordic countries, Afghanistan, with NATO as a military front. The reason which was given outside was to stop Al-Qaeda. A group was not actually from Afghanistan, it was from some from Saudi Arabia, from an ally of USA and Saudi Arabia. And during these years, hundreds and thousands of people have been killed. Millions of people have had to flee to other countries. Children have lost their parents. Parents have lost their children. Hospitals and care services have been attacked by the Taliban and bombed by NATO drones. After 20 years invasion, then it was decided then that NATO operations would be ended in Afghanistan, and the country is now in ruins. Taliban is much stronger today than before the invasion. Girls' and women's rights are limited drastically, and also executions of people who are against the Taliban happen every day, and Afghanistan is now in the hands of dictatorial extremists with terrible values. And also those who won this were those who traded in weapons. And my question is to General Jens Stoltenberg, are you satisfied with the result? How many times should this happen? How many times will you falsely say that you can bomb countries to democracy? Thank you.
Some of the most difficult decisions we make as political leaders, regardless of whether it is in individual countries or in NATO. When should we apply military force and when should we not? Both decisions are difficult. I was an active politician in Norway when the world society criticized the West for not intervening when we saw the Srebrenica massacre and also the genocide in Rwanda. Then it was wrong that we didn't actually intervene with military power. Then we have also applied military power in the Balkans, in Kosovo and Bosnia, but I believe it was right that when we saw that activities were organized from Afghanistan, killing almost 3,000 people, it was right to use military force in Afghanistan. It was wrong in 2003, and I believe that then, and I still do, that it was wrong to use force in Iraq. And my only message to you is that thinking that we should never use military power, that we should have refrained from using military force against Al-Qaeda and also ISIS. I can't say that. It's not as if we can see that there are groups organizing the attacks on millions of people without doing nothing. Well, we can't do that. Our main goal in Afghanistan was to prevent terrorism, to defeat Al-Qaeda, and we have prevented that. And during the 2 decades, we haven't had any terrorist attacks organized from Afghanistan. Now, after having pulled out, we must still try to safeguard that situation. That will not be easy, but it is not as if that means that it was wrong to prevent more terrorist attacks.
Thank you, Chair Secretary Stoltenberg. Thank you for your presentation. In our Nordic countries, we're a family, but we have also siblings who have chosen different lines of defence. As we've said, some of our members of NATO, otherwise members of EU, sometimes some are members of both. Now, you as the Secretary General of NATO, and you look at this, how we're divided in different kinds of work in the Nordics, both with restrictions and opportunities, for example, in relation to China's global expansion, but also with a view to EU's strategic compass, for example. It would be interesting to hear what you have to say on this. Thank you very much.
It is an actual reality that the various countries have chosen different ties to NATO and the EU. Like I said, I was in favor of my own country, Norway, to join the EU, but the Norwegian people said no, so I have to relate to reality and accept that. And of course, I also know that Sweden and Finland have not wanted to join the NATO, and we have to accept that. It's not as if the European Union can't go to Norway and convince the people of becoming a member, and NATO can go to Sweden and Finland to convince them to become members. So until those countries on an independent basis choose to do something else, then we need to actually accept that we have chosen different solutions. And we have now achieved good and close collaboration. This is also proof of that. And therefore, we need to continue to collaborating in the Nordic Council.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for a very good speech.
The political contents now may be better than when you were Prime Minister. Well, I know that. But what about the approach? Well, maybe then you are kind of marked by not which alliance you are a member of, but which meetings you attend. We also see that there will be an upcoming meeting, and I see that there is a meeting where Norway has chosen to go there as an observer, along with Sweden and Finland. Denmark has chosen not to. Even though the General Secretary General is Norwegian, but what about Norway's attendance of such a meeting? Do you have any opinions? What signals you send out if you would be there? All questions linked to nuclear weapons are very important, and therefore in NATO we want them to be discussed in NATO. We had a defense ministers meeting a couple of weeks ago, and that was one of the topics. We had good discussions discussions there, and we want to follow them up, among other things, by discussions and work on disarmament prior to the foreign minister meetings in NATO in December. So this is an ongoing consultation we'll have. Our goal is, as always, that we will draw joint conclusions. As to the main question, NATO's stand is very clear. NATO wants a world without nuclear weapons, but as long as there are nuclear weapons, we want to maintain our nuclear deterrence, quite simply because we don't believe that a world where we at NATO has got rid of all our nuclear weapons, while countries as Russia, China and North Korea have the nuclear capability. We don't believe that that would be a safer world. We believe it will be more dangerous. So the route towards disarmament is a step-by-step mutual build-down. And the prohibition agreement does not have any requirements for verification and this mutual disarmament. And it is the START agreement and the non-proliferation agreements that are the road towards disarmament. All NATO countries agree.
Rasmus Emborn. Without a microphone. Speaker without a microphone. Speaker speaking off microphone. Let's try that again. Thank you for an important speech, Mr. Stoltenberg. In the Youth Council of the Nordics, we're very worried about China's development in the Nordics, in the EU and the rest of the world, and that is across all party lines. We mean that if something is done now to change that it's going to have influence over all of our infrastructure, then we risk one day to be in a situation where we can be threatened and all of our values and our democracy, our freedom of expression and human rights can no longer be safe. Not in the EU, not in the Nordics. We must not come to that point. It's about time we put on the brakes. You say that NATO should do more in our borders. Our question is, how do you look at the opportunity that the European governments, in collaboration with NATO, with expert panels, with intelligence services and other relevant actors, would identify critical infrastructure in our countries and forbid the selling of these to Chinese actors? Thank you for the floor.
I believe that that is one of the ways that we need to discuss, namely how we can protect critical infrastructure, how we can protect critical knowledge and technology. We should not copy and replicate the mechanisms we had during the Cold War. But if you remember the discussions on the 5G network, in some countries said it was purely commercial and economic questions. But in NATO, we spent a lot of time on sharing knowledge and information with NATO states and explained that who controls the 5G network is not only about commercial and economic interests, it's also about security, because they will be responsible for health, for infrastructure, for all services. And something important has happened, because from a situation where hardly any countries actually put any political policy interest into it, we have now seen that there is important security policy implications, and they use this. So here we see that NATO has actually also impacted on the discussion of such questions. We need to progress how we protect our technology and to ensure that our technological advance and progress cannot simply be taken over by China when it has major security policy implications. Well, I have to stop after 2 minutes, but I would like to add, you started to talk about human rights and democracy, and I have been young once, and we also went out in the street demonstrating to protest against things in South America and also in Russia. I would have liked to see protests against the protests in Hong Kong. They lived for years with all the freedoms, but also I'm concerned about China, that they can impact our security, but also because they simply don't share the values we have. They may disagree with us in the Nordics, but there are values that have been infringed on by China, and they've done it towards their own citizens.
And then it's Erkki Tuomioja. Thank you. In Finland, we're satisfied with our partnership with NATO, but it doesn't mean that we have plans to join the organization. But NATO underscores its role as the defender of democracy, human rights and the rule of law, and also the principles that we have in the EU. But in order to be able to promote these, then we don't need weapons. We need to be effective. We need to have our own house in order. And that is why in the EU we've had to take on board certain member states who clearly are in breach of certain principles and infringe upon them. And also there are two, besides these two countries in NATO, with which we have the same problems. And that's why I would like to ask, how can both the EU and NATO look at these phenomena in our own backyard to be able to that when we want to protect democracy? Thank you.
NATO is based on some basic core values, rule of law and also democracy and freedom. Many of them also the basis of the EU. I protect them, I defend them when I visit member states, and it's an important basis for NATO. But as many other international organizations, NATO also faces a dilemma because we are an organization between independent states, and some of those states don't want any international organization to have the power to intervene in what they see as internal business. And that dilemma sometimes means that we face a situation where some membership countries are critical, are dissatisfied with how a member state live up to democratic standards such as democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of other freedoms. And therefore, how do you express such criticism? My best answer is that we should use the platform that NATO represents or the European Union represents to sit down around the same tables in the same room and raise that criticism. And I encourage membership states to be clearer in such debate, because sometimes I experience that they are clearer in fora where the countries and questions are not represented, and then they use that to. Therefore, we use the possibility we have in order to raise it in the forum where we are together, because we need to keep order in our own house. Otherwise, we can't defend the democracy.
There are still 6 speakers, and we can use all of them if we have enough time. The next speaker is Paul Johnson. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary General Stoltenberg, for your leadership in NATO, which really has taken NATO and the Nordics closer together. And thank you so much that you also visited Sweden and Finland last week. We very appreciated. Sweden and Finland are close partners in NATO. We've become even closer during this Hands Opportunity Partnership, and we've contributed to exercises, and we've got a better political dialogue, and we're extremely extremely dependent on the security which NATO offers in the close areas, not the least through the military close proximity presence also in the Baltics. At the same time, there's also a difference between membership and partnership. My question is that if there are still actions that Finland and Sweden can take to deepen our partnership with NATO, or is it membership, which is the next step in our process? Thank you very much.
We can do more. We can do more of what we are already doing. We can have more exercises, train more, and we can also expand the systems we have for communication, for being able to operate together and also deal with crises. So we can strengthen the ties with Sweden and Finland. But at some point you will come to a situation where only membership will give you full rights. Being a member also represents some obligations, but also rights. So the basic principle of NATO, Article 5, about the collective defense, where we say that a defense against an attack against one country represents an attack against all. That applies to members, not all partners, and it's up to Sweden to choose whether or not they want to come under that article.
Then it was Per Arne Håkansson. Chair, the Nordic countries have, through a number of activities, and also have to also trust and also internationally and through our countries about international collaboration. We've seen the importance of diplomacy, and it doesn't have to be. And this is not necessarily looking at just a time which is more protectionist. One key, I think, is that there is a strong also anchoring in civil society in the importance of diplomacy and international cross-border cooperation. We welcome this visit of NATO in Finland and Sweden. We welcome that, and with this perspective in mind, then the partnership in its present shape is good, but the key is also the anchoring for diplomacy and work. How does Stoltenberg see how we can put this on the agenda more?
I'm a strong supporter of diplomacy and dialogue. I'm convinced that the best armed forces are the armed forces that we don't need to employ. So it's the best solution is not winning a war, it's preventing a war. So I believe that NATO should put up a defense, within NATO and also in collaboration with Sweden and Finland. It is not so that we can kind of come to a situation where we confirm the capability and power of these forces. It's to prevent war. It's always the first and best policy instrument is always negotiations and dialogue. Sometimes you don't have an alternative. I don't know one single party that believed that it was wrong to use military power against ISIS in Syria. We used a lot of military forces, a lot of air attacks, drones, etc. But that was because we had come to a situation in Europe that was so far right that it was impossible to negotiate with ISIS. So it was the last resort. Sometimes it's important.
Ville Kaunisto, the Conservative Group. Chair, Secretary-General. Honour Chair, Secretary-General, 90% of NATO's we're also involved in very intensively, and data information is power. So we want to ask that do we need the very isolated? Does that mean that we are safer? This is also a historical Act. And from the USA, where they've said that this fight is being lost for China, and Europe in these discussions is not even mentioned. The European Union has made its own strategy for artificial intelligence, and unfortunately there's the danger that both the ambition and bureaucracy do not support technological developed Nordic countries, and this is definitely negative for us in the European Union. Secretary General, do you see that in this future battle that artificial intelligence is very much a part of it, that all Nordics and also with NATO should have more collaboration, and that would be more added value also to the whole world in that case?
More cooperation on new technology and AI would be a clear advantage, and we need to collaborate as Nordic countries, as NATO countries, and along with partners such as Sweden and Finland. One of the most important initiatives that we addressed at the NATO summit this summer was to set up a new innovation fund within NATO to strengthen the development of new technologies. And we also designed our first strategy for artificial intelligence, simply because we understand that we need to coordinate our efforts to set some standards about how to apply it, and also to avoid misuse and abuse of it. But at the overarching level, I have to say I don't think that we understand the dimensions of what such things will look in the future. I live in Brussels. They didn't understand what the Industrial Revolution mean for future warfare until they saw all people die in the trenches. Autonomous system, drones, face recognitions linked into weapon systems. That changes completely the nature of warfare, just like the Industrial Revolution did. And we face two dilemmas. One thing is that we must avoid and prevent that our opponents get ahead in terms of technology. The second is that once you start using such technology and weapon systems, we do it, other people do it, then we need to have some systems established for weapon control and ethical warfare. That's not easy, but what it takes is that people sit down together and also use NATO as a tool, both to establish ethical control mechanisms and guidelines.
Emilia Töran, Social Democrats. Thank you, Chair. Secretary General, the biggest threat against the world today is the climate threat. And in the Arctic, then very big industrial establishments are happening, which are going to have some of the solutions. But as you yourself said, as Jonas also was cited as saying, that we need peace for development. And then my question is, which threats do you see as the worst and biggest towards a peaceful Arctic?
I've stopped trying to predict the next crisis, because every time someone has tried to predict it, then they've been wrong. No one predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall, 9/11. No one predicted the huge growth in ISIS in the spring of 2014. So instead of trying to tell you what the biggest threat is or the next crisis is, for example, relative to the Arctic, I will say that you need to prepare for the unexpected instead of trying to predict something that you can't predict. You need to be prepared for surprises. And like I said, in Finland, it's about being able to handle crises, especially those that you can't anticipate and predict. Shortly or briefly on the climate, we made the decisions. We stated that the climate is important for NATO. You need to see the link between climate and crisis, and you also need to bring down emissions. If the goal is zero emissions, then military emissions must also be reduced. And it's not a question question of whether or not to have environmental-friendly fighter planes or quick, rapid fighter planes, but you need to strike a balance, and NATO will also be at the forefront because we need both. And we also need to adjust our military operations with more extreme heat, a higher sea level. Then, of course, it also impacts on how we carry out our military operations. And NATO was also present for the first time during such a COP meeting in Glasgow.
Camilla Gunnell, Social Democrats. Thank you, Chair, and very many thanks, Mr. Stoltenberg, for your speech. I also want to continue on the climate issue, since the more the temperatures increase in the world, the bigger the crisis and catastrophes, and perhaps also conflicts and wars in the wake of that. How does the traditional defense preparedness differ from preparedness to handle scenarios such as follow-ups of climate change, and how far can NATO go to become a defense alliance against global warming?
NATO can play a role. NATO is not the principal tool to deal with climate change. That would be the United Nations and other organizations. But we will shoulder our share of the responsibility, both by contributing towards a reduction in military emissions, but also by adjusting. And adjusting means that, for example, if you have a Danish contingent in Iraq and there were more than 50 degrees plus, and that impacts on what kind of operations, what kind of uniforms our soldier needs, more wind, more extreme weather, more storms will matter and impact on the vessels that we operate, and also other equipment. And also when the ice melts around the poles, that would also impact. We incorporate this in our plan, our capability goals, and also our exercises in order to strengthen our military defense. But the first thing we need to do is to get good reliable numbers, because military emissions have not been part of the environmental statistics. In the Kyoto Protocol, then military emissions were exempted. They haven't been included. And after that, it hasn't been properly integrated. And now in NATO, we want to create a framework for how to measure military emissions, to record it and get it down on paper. Thank you.
And May-Britt Lagersen, Social Democrats.
Thank you, Jens. It's nice to see you. I'm also an ardent European Union supporter, but of course some of us are a bit younger, so I only voted in the referendum once. Thank you for a good speech. There's just been a general election in Norway, and we have finally got our first Prime Minister from the Labour Party, and that is after the Secretary General of NATO stepped down. The government has, in its political coalition platform, said that Norway should attend as an observer in the treaty against the ban on nuclear weapons meeting. We said in the campaign to work actively to ban all nuclear weapons. But still, it's not possible to achieve this, not even through the treaty, until the countries with nuclear weapons and those who develop it commit themselves to get rid of them. We have decided to be an observer. Is time up already? All right, I'm sorry. The question is, what are your views on what the Nordic countries can do in order to get a nuclear-free world? We believe in arms control, mutual disarmament. We don't believe in the NATO countries engaging any unilateral disarmament. And we also believe that when you sign disarmament agreement, you need very strong control regimes. There are many problems, many disappointments, but I want to say one thing, namely that there have been decades of good disarmament work. We also have a non-proliferation agreement that has prevented many new countries from developing nuclear weapons, and also that Ukraine and South Africa and other countries that have got rid of theirs. That is quite an achievement. We also have several bilateral agreements that has also reduced the number of countries with nuclear weapons. At the end of the Cold War, the total number was 12,000. Now it's 1,550 on each side of nuclear warheads. So I will say that despite all the setbacks that we've had, also when it comes to mid-range missiles, there are also many examples that prove that arms control work, and negotiations about those goals can only lead us forward in our work. Next is the Center Group.
Chair, Secretary General in Finland is, as we know, not a member of NATO, and neither is Sweden, but members of many of central cooperation organizations. We exercise this together, and we think about the operation in Afghanistan and also the retreat from there. And it's one of the big reasons that it went as well as it did, is that we had practiced together and we knew each other well. If we think about the future and discussions about EU's defense competencies, then of course there are different views as to what it means, as to which competencies we're talking about. Some people think it's perhaps only about a defense against hybrids, and other ones I think about more regular military capacities. And with the thought of cooperation, it has quite a lot of meaning. Some might think it's quite unproblematic. Others can quickly create double competencies and perhaps problems in the practical coordination. How do you see this? How do you see that this kind of EU capacity works, and how do you see how EU and NATO can work together in this way?
We're positive when it comes to European countries obtaining new and strong military capabilities, whether that be tanks, new vessels, airplanes, drones, or an increase. What we warn against is to establish new structures that will only compete for the same military capabilities, especially if the new structures also support a notion that the European Union can go the course alone, because I think it is more important than ever that Europe and North America work together and also collaborate with close partners such as Sweden and Finland. Not that we go alone in situations where we are more challenged than ever. It's more important that we stand together. I also believe that we need to understand that the European Union cannot defend Europe. As it was said, 80% of NATO's investments in defense come from non-EU countries, and it's about money. It comes from investments. You have Iceland in one end, you have Turkey, and you have also Canada and the US. They're all important for the defense, and any attempt at weakening the link between Europe and North America will not only weaken us, but also not only weaken North America, but also weaken Europe. So despite all the differences, we need to stand together, North America and Europe together. So the message is stand together. That's the best option forward. Thank you. Thank you for your thorough answers and responses.